Today, let's talk a little more about technique. In the last video, I spoke about developing my technique over the years, some of the things that I felt worked, some that were kind of in question, and just my general thoughts about it all. And I know it was quite vague, so today I want to talk about more specifics regarding exercises, building a diverse repertoire, what all of those things I mentioned in the video mean. So first of all, let's talk about building your repertoire for a season. And I'll talk about what is pretty standard for most piano majors. And this is something that I went through throughout conservatory. And I would recommend to anyone looking to just have a diverse repertoire for the year. I would include one piece from a lot of these major genres within classical piano repertoire. For example, a classical sonata, something by Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, early Schubert, and then a piece by Bach or Scarlatti, maybe a prelude and fugue, some inventions and sinfonia, or a partita, a suite, that sort of thing. A significant work by a romantic composer, maybe a romantic sonata by Brahms, Liszt, Chopin, Schumann, or a scherzo, ballades, any one of those categories. There are so many different options, but something substantial, maybe 15 minutes or longer, something more challenging than your current level. And then a couple etudes. A lot of times Chopin etudes are great for this because they are very focused in terms of what technique they're focusing on. Usually, teachers would recommend, a small piece or a piece 5 to 10 minutes by a modern composer. And depending on your program and what you're studying, a lot of times the other parts of the repertoire, other parts of your time will be spent on chamber music, piano concertos, things like that. But this is sort of the general guideline that a lot of piano majors will follow. Now, if you follow these guidelines and work on these pieces to performance level, really perfect them, you will be challenging yourself and you will be developing your technique. But let me challenge what I just said and imagine a scenario where you're learning these pieces, but you're really glossing over them, so you're really not getting much out of learning these pieces. And that is quite common. And I think that's because a lot of times we get into this comfort zone with pieces that we're learning, and once we learn the notes, we just repeat certain sections, not with much focus, but just casually repeat the pieces, and there's no progression. So let's look at some specific examples of how we can do this. So say that you're learning Opus 31, number 2 by Beethoven, his Tempest Sonata. Right at the beginning, you have one of the, I would say, really difficult and tricky techniques to get around. The pairs of notes, and you're repeating them. This passage becomes easier once you repeat it a lot, but then a lot of times when you set the sonata aside and you come back to it, it becomes just as hard. Like right now, if I were to play that is difficult to me, and I haven't looked at this since the Beethoven video that I did, which was back in December. Okay, that's a little better, but it's difficult. So how would you work on this? Of course, there are the tried and trusted ways where you add different types of rhythms, accents, all of this, and all of these things I've again mentioned in previous videos, and you can check those out. So say that you want to turn this into a more focused study, turn it into an exercise. Well, first let's examine what exactly is happening here so that we could work with it and perhaps build another exercise or just build a focus study where we can just drill this. So what's happening, I would say, the most obvious thing, all of these pitches are being repeated and they're in these groups, like is in the score. And the pitches involved are based around this triad, this minor triad in second inversion, F, D, and A. And with these pitches, what's happening is that we're always including the chromatic lower neighbor tone. So C sharp to the D, and then the G sharp to the A, and the E to the F. So, and again, we're repeating each pitch. Now, with that information, we could apply this same pattern, the same mold to another triad. First, baby steps, let's just try it on a C minor second inversion triad. Now, that's also a form of transposition, but we're really looking at it in terms of looking at how it's built and then recreating it. Now, let's try another thing. Let's say an A major second inversion triad. So this time major instead of minor. Okay, so on and so forth. Maybe let's now go to an C sus. Maybe that's possible. Actually doesn't sound that good, so we're just gonna skip that. Let's see. Maybe an E flat chordal. Also doesn't sound that great. So let's just stick to major triads and minor triads. Again, you can just try, like I did right now, try different triads, different chords, and see what sounds interesting to you. And maybe you come across a chord that is interesting and also challenging in a way where you're interested in practicing this over and over. The point is to find different ways to vary this exact, these four measures, and practice them in different ways so that at the end of this, or maybe you do this over the course of several days or weeks, you are so familiar with this technique that coming back to this is very easy. Now, of course, is this necessary? You can argue that it's not. You can say that you can just practice these notes in this exact form and perfect it. But to me, it's not that interesting. And also, say that you create this exercise and you cycle it through all these different chords and you become familiar with it, it becomes part of a technique that you're very, very comfortable with, and it's a part of your personal technique. I don't know if that made sense, but for me, that's way more interesting. So now let's talk a little bit about exercises. In the previous video, I talked about how in certain circumstances, they are very beneficial and in others, really not necessary. So say that you have this diverse repertoire covering all these different genres within piano repertoire and including some etudes, chances are they aren't really necessary unless you want to work on a specific type of technique. To give a specific example, when I was, I think, a junior in college, I asked my teacher for some warm-up routines, and he showed me this one exercise, which is a series of fourths and fifths using alternate fingers, and you're cycling through, I think, just going up by half step. But this is an exercise that was modified from one of the exercises from Brahms's 51 exercises book. So this exercise was really interesting to me at the time, even though I was working on a pretty diverse repertoire. I don't remember the specific pieces, but I was working on a lot of pieces by Chopin, Beethoven, Liszt, Brahms, Ravel, all of these different composers. I had etudes, I had sonatas, a lot of pieces that were challenging, but none of the pieces that I was working on had this technique. So this interested me, and I decided to include it into my practice routine because I wanted to feel comfortable with this specific technique. So in this way, even though I had a diverse repertoire, this exercise, to me at least, was beneficial. Now going back to the other point where maybe you're coming to the piano as a secondary instrument, or you're learning piano in a way where you're not interested in, or you don't have the time to have a massive repertoire. Maybe you're only learning just a few pieces, maybe just 5 inventions by Bach, something very limited in terms of diversity. Maybe you want to include some other exercises that work on techniques that aren't being covered. Your average piece, your average invention by Bach, there's a lot of passage work where you're working on these different intervals. A lot of the rhythm is pretty similar. There aren't too many leaps. There aren't too many octaves, or a lot of filigree, that sort of thing. So maybe find an exercise. Definitely would recommend Brahms's 51 exercises if you're intermediate to advanced. And also the exercises that I show you all on my channel and here on Patreon. This can also apply to you if you're a beginner pianist and you're not yet playing substantial pieces like I talked about in the last video. Maybe you want to just get started on certain passage work. A Czerny exercise is pretty good for that. Okay, number 23 from, I think, Opus 809. I could be wrong. You have repeated notes. Would I play this over turning the Beethoven passage into another exercise of repeated notes? No, this is boring and not that interesting, and it doesn't do much for me. Yes, I'll be working on repeated notes, but there are other ways to tackle this. So in this way, it's really a preference thing. But maybe at the beginning of your practice sessions, you're the type, and sometimes I'm this way as well, I want to start my practice session with something that isn't too involved. I just want to get some blood flowing in my fingers before I start, working on a piece, whether it's writing or learning a piece of repertoire or improvising. Maybe you just want to do a low-key exercise like this where I don't want to say your brain can kind of check out, but it's really neutral. If that's your thing, totally do it. So regarding Czerny, instead of choosing those exercises that are pretty dry, although they're really efficient in terms of tackling one specific technique, I would recommend his Opus 261, for example, which focuses more on passage work. So these are more like excerpts. This is a lot more interesting than some of his more neutral and singular exercises, for example, the one that we saw before. Yes, we are being very efficient about working on this specific technique, and we're not really wasting any time, but this is in the context of harmony, depending on, there are so many exercises here, I think 60 pages it says, and there's harmony. These are kind of like excerpts. This is a lot more interesting, and I would maybe choose several of these to work on. Maybe when you're playing other pieces, you want to include something that has a more, not aggressive, but just more intense finger work. So definitely look into these over others. Again, this is just my recommendation. It all depends on your preference. What makes you feel interested in playing the piano and practicing will work the best, because maybe you're the type you really want to do something very singular and focused and dry and neutral. Do that. If you want a little more passage-like playing, do this. And if you don't want to do exercises like I showed in the beginning with the Beethoven, there are ways that you can take a passage from repertoire and work on it in different ways, where essentially what you're doing is turning it into an exercise. So I hope that helped. Again, regarding exercises, there's so many books. I will put in a list of some books that I've tried. And again, of course, there are the exercises that I come up with and show you all. But I would really encourage you all to start making your own anyway, because there's something really interesting about creating your own exercises and practicing them. So anyway, I hope that was helpful. I will see you very soon. I plan to make some more videos regarding this topic, and maybe I'm a little inspired to look at Czerny again. So maybe there's something regarding Czerny coming soon. But anyway, practice well, stay safe, see you soon.